Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Kim Scott, co-founder of Radical Candor and author of Radical Candor and Just Work.
I'm Jason Rosoff, CEO and co-founder of Radical Candor.
And I'm Amy Sandler, your host for the Radical Candor podcast. You know, folks regularly write into our advice email with some questions about how can I actually practice radical candor. Today, we're going to reach into that Radical Candor advice mailbag. I think it's a digital mailbag, but we're reaching in and we're answering some of your questions. So, Jason, Kim, do you have your advice hats on?
I love it. I'm not sure I have my advice hat, but I have my thinking cap on. I'll have ideas and you all will give me some feedback on whether my ideas are any good or not. It's going to be a fun conversation.
Is that a Harry Potter thinking cap? And if so, do we need to know?
No, it's not a Harry Potter.
I think you meant the sorting hat. No thinking cap. No mystical thinking cap. A figurative but very real thinking cap.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So now that we're already answering questions so skillfully. Our first question, this is one we get a lot, and it's an issue that makes lots of folks uncomfortable. So here we go. I'm going to start reading. Hello. I discovered y'all when my partner, who works at an apartment complex, found your book in an abandoned apartment.
Can I just say already amazing?
I just had to pause. I think that to me, I just have this vision of like an empty apartment with just like a stray copy of Radical Candor left behind.
and shining on it from a papered window where the top corner of the paper has peeled away. The beam of light.
Maybe there's a breeze sort of blowing the pages. It's cinematic.
You two are way more optimistic than I am. What I see is an abandoned, lonely copy of Radical Candor that's been rescued by this listener. So let's hear what the listener had to say.
This person's partner brought it home. It just seems so fitting given my current situation. Funny how things work. All that to be said, I'm currently 28 years old, manager of a smallish company, and they have 10 employees currently, but do some fairly big business, about $1.7 million US a year. So this person is currently in year 3 of a 4-year transition. They're going to become the owner of this company and will be 30 years old at that time. So they write, "Well, I feel incredibly blessed to be in this position. 95% of it's great. I really struggle with garnering respect from potential hires. I've had on multiple occasions, people say they didn't want to work for a kid to my face. I suppose I get that, but it weighs on me heavily at the same time. Are there steps I can take to set an example of maturity and leadership?" And they close saying, "For the more tenured employees that work for me, they all say I do a good job. It's just a matter of growing gray hair. Perhaps it is. I figured if anyone has some solid advice, it would be the wonderful folks at Radical Candor." So let me first start by asking if either of you have actually had experience with this specific situation. Didn't want to work for a kid.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I went for a long time. I was the youngest. And then all of a sudden one day I was the oldest. I don't know when or how that happened.
Well, Kim, I feel that in my bones.
Yes.
So, I went from being the kid to being the adult supervision in like 1 week. It was very strange.
That's exactly what it felt like. I will say, reading this note, one of the things that, before we even get into the advice, that stands out to me is I appreciate the sort of self-awareness that this person is showing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the question, is there a way to set an example of maturity and leadership, makes it seem as though it's them and their behavior that's the problem, when it's probably actually the other person and their perception that is the issue. And so part of the question is, how do you help that? You may change all your behavior and that person still sees you as a kid, right?
Yeah, and maybe they like seeing you as a kid, actually.
Correct. That's exactly
not a
where
criticism.
I was going.
Yeah.
Yeah, where I was going is that there is often when someone says something like this, I often think it reveals more about them than it does reveal about you. And so I think my first piece of advice would be, don't take this as a as a targeted criticism of you or your leadership. We can get to some tips on like what you can do to address it, but I feel bad when people find themselves in this position. It makes me sad that they interpret this as some sort of objective criticism of them when it's more about the other person's perception of them.
And it also might be the case, like if someone came up to me, which they said, I don't know if they said exactly, I don't want to work for a kid, but they made some kind of comment about how young I was. And at first I felt like somehow I should be older or I should grow gray hair. And that obviously, wasn't going to happen right away. And I think in retrospect, what I wish I had done is to realize that this person is giving me some feedback and it's not clear to me what they mean. Right. Mm-hmm. And so I think if I were young enough that someone would come up to me today and say, I don't want to work for a kid, I think what I would say is, am I doing something that is annoying you? Do you not want to work for me? Mm-hmm. And just ask the question point blank. I think one of the things that is really helpful in a situation where there may be a reason why someone doesn't want to work for you is to get those reasons on the table. Like, am I doing something that is annoying you? Like, am I doing something that feels immature to you? I would hope that I would be able to have the maturity to ask that question. I don't know. What do you all think?
Well, what I was thinking, Kim, you do so much work around sort of bias masquerading as feedback and perception. And when I was looking at this question, it made me think that in many ways, age seems to be one of these somewhat acceptable biases in some way. We all sort of go from being the kid to the gray hair. And I too, I don't feel like I had that time when I had just the right amount of of sort of highlighted hair. And it makes me wonder, like, is somehow that biasing okay because we're all going to be young and we're all going to be older? So I think there's something interesting just about that as perception. And to Jason, your point about it's saying more about that person than it is maybe about you. And I think Kim is sort of going a little deeper on that and saying, what specifically am I doing? And so I guess I'm curious, like, if after the specifics, if it's, oh no, everything's fine, I just would rather work with someone with more experience, like, how would you react to something that is maybe more about experience or tenure or something measurable rather than sort of perception around immaturity?
Yeah, I was going to say that there's a two-step to get to Kim's question. And the two-step in my mind is, why don't you want to work for a kid? What is it about working for a kid that like makes you nervous? Mm-hmm. And I think, and then depending, like they might, I guess what I would say is that the reason why it makes me sad and not mad when someone says something like this is I think they've given you a gift, which is they said, hey, I've got this perception of you that may be unjust.
Yeah.
And especially because the power dynamic is reversed. In most of the sort of like unjust situations that we think of, it tends to be the boss who's being unjust to the team member. But in this reverse situation, they've given you a gift because you can leverage the authority that you have to ask that question and plumb the depths, be curious about where that might be coming from. And hopefully that gets you to some specifics. The examples that you gave, Amy, the thing I worry about is wanting someone with more tenure or someone with more experience. Those are also euphemisms.
Yes,
they're also
right.
So they're still not. They're not telling you. And so the way that I would think about it is to first have some humility and say, look, my goal is to be the best leader that I can be, the best manager, the best boss that I can be for this team. And I feel like you're telling me something that could be very useful to me, but I don't quite understand what it is that I do differently. So I'm curious, like, what is it about working for a kid that worries you? And then with the humility of saying, my goal is to learn something from you in this case, I think my guess is it probably opens up a lot, because when I experienced this, I was very blunt. It was like, you don't know what you're doing. You're just a 26-year-old kid. Like it was very direct. And I did not immediately take it well. I was pretty hurt in the moment. when the person said that. But
Wait, what exactly did they say to you, Jason?
You're just a 26-year-old kid. You have no idea what you're doing.
Okay. So you weren't blunt. The feedback was blunt.
Correct. The feedback to me was very direct.
Yes. And maybe a little obnoxiously aggressive.
Yes. And in the moment, I sort of had to walk away from the conversation. So I didn't take it well immediately, but I went back to the person and said, look, I recognize that you have many more years experience in this particular job than I do. But you don't have more years of experience managing a team necessarily. You have more technical experience than I do. And I honor that. My job is to be the best manager that I can be. And so I want to learn from you. So if I'm doing something that's causing a problem for you, I want you to tell me about that. And I'm committing to you right now to take seriously any criticism that you have that especially if you think it's coming from my lack of experience. And it took a couple of conversations like that to reassure this person that I was really serious. But eventually what they revealed to me is like, this is not an uncommon occurrence for them. They've never been interested in management. And as a result, their bosses have frequently been younger and less experienced than them because they've been in this industry forever. And most of them were not humble and did not care to learn from their expertise. And so they felt like they were horribly mismanaged for the past 2 decades of their 40-year career. And when they told me that, it like made the rest of it all made sense. Because I was like, okay, like you're projecting onto me this experience that you had with somebody else. And because of that, I have to work very hard to earn your trust, to actually establish a relationship where it feels like you can say the thing that you are really concerned about, as opposed to sort of covering it with the anger and bravado of you're just a kid and you don't know what you're talking about.
And I think also when someone has a bunch of experience, they have and they're not the manager. They've often trained several managers. They've taught several managers.
That's such a good point. Yeah.
There are few things that are more annoying than teaching your manager about your job, because all of a sudden you're teaching this person what you're doing, and then they're going to judge you on whether you're doing, it is, having been in that seat as well, it's annoying. And especially if you've had a bunch of different managers. And so being aware of that and asking what you can do to decrease that annoyance, I think is really helpful. So sort of understanding, I think this feedback, I don't want to work for a kid. There's a lot of chaff in that feedback, but there's also a kernel of wheat. And your job when you're the manager is to separate the wheat from the chaff and look for that one grain of wheat and help it grow.
Now I'm thinking about back to farming. We'll have our next conversation about wheat and chaff. I think you also talked about clearing the cruff out, which I guess is not related to chaff, Kim.
No, that's a different problem.
But before we move on from this one, Kim, did you have anything that came up for you around bias and age as being any different from other types of biases?
Yeah, I think we've talked about this a couple of times, but one of the things that I have observed, it more happens the opposite direction, but it happens in both directions, is that we feel somehow freer than we ought to insult someone because of their generation, right? And I think it's because that's one of the biases, which is still a bias. It's still no good, but it's not as fraught as the other biases we're trying to. It's not as fraught as racism or sexism. Ageism is not for some people, and so they're more free to insult, especially the younger generation. The older generation feels.
Are you showing some biases?
Yes, no doubt. Thank you for challenging them. But I've noticed maybe it's more problematic. It's not older or younger, but people who tend to be and have more power tend to be older. Not always, but tend to be.
Clearly, it's
and so they'll say, this younger generation. It's every kid got a trophy. They insult the younger generation. and it's a way, often they insult the younger generation when the younger generation is trying to give them some feedback. And so I think that is something that we need to watch out for. And then the other, the okay boomer thing also, it's somehow that's okay to laugh about. And partly it's okay to laugh about, maybe because you're kicking up, not down. I don't know. What do you all think?
Generational power struggles are like just a fact of human existence. I think it's sort of funny because if you go back through history, you can always find a book that says the coming generation is the laziest,
yes.
It is like the most ill prepared, and we've been saying this for thousands of years. Since we've had written record, the older generation has been complaining that the next and somehow we are still here. Like, we've survived, and all of those ill-prepared generations have somehow
moved humanity forward, actually.
Yeah. Yes. So I think in that context, when you live in a world where like that criticism is levied constantly, I think it's sort of an act of protest. The okay boomer thing is an act of protest, to be like, well, you don't know everything either.
Yeah. In fact, I mean, I've said this before, but it is the job of the younger generation to challenge the older generation. That is what helps us make progress as humanity. Now, I don't think that would be...
I was just going to say, I can hear your kids just cutting out that little snippet and replaying that over and over, Kim. So
believe me, this is the house of radical candor.
They've gotten that message.
Yes, they've gotten that message. My mother was visiting recently, and she was like, "Wow, your kids really feel free to tell you what they think, don't they?" So, but she didn't say they're disrespectful, so that was good. So I think that it wouldn't be a great idea for this younger manager to tell the person who said, "I don't want to work for a kid," that what moves humanity forward is the younger generation. That would not have been a good response.
Nor would okay boomer have been a good response, probably, in that case.
Neither one of those things.
So context and power are sort of layering into all of that. Shall we move on to our next question from someone who is tired of paying the asshole tax?
Let's do it.
Favorite topics.
One thing before we do, which is that I think the thread, the way that you stop the sort of generations barking at each other is to focus on your shared humanity, like to have a real human conversation with that person about what they actually are worried about and what you're worried about. Like that vulnerable sharing is the way that you cut through the generational noise.
Beautifully said, Jason. And I think your response to that, I don't want to work for a 26-year-old, was a perfect example of how to have that one-on-one relationship building, which is really, the core of Radical Candor. So addressing someone tired of paying the asshole tax, this person writes, quote, "I have an insurmountable problem. It won't matter how much I apply Radical Candor when my CEO undoes everything I do. I'm now leaving my fourth job working for someone who's never read any management books, is making very basic mistakes like publicly humiliating people, thinking that job satisfaction is irrelevant because they're paying and that's all that matters, refusing to buy the tools people need, randomly breaking processes without warning, explanation, or apology. They're demanding employees install spyware on their computers. We had an episode about that, and refusing to pay for the time they went to the toilet." Wow. I keep reading books like Radical Candor. I feel like it's useless. What's the point of learning to have better one-on-ones when my boss is telling me, quote, "They're just contractors. They do as they're told. Stop having one-on-ones with them." By the way, this person still has them just in secret. "This has been my life for the past 7 years. Do you have a solution?" Here I'm thinking that maybe there's a job board or a networking group where you only get access if you buy into the ideas of Radical Candor, where a CTO like me can find a CEO that's not destructive. And I have to say, I was all going along with this note, and I was kind of surprised to get to the CTO at the very end there. But Kim, Jason, maybe I'll start with you, Jason. What leapt out at you from this note from this person who's now leaving their fourth job working for someone who keeps making a lot of mistakes.
Yeah, I will admit that I was also quite surprised that this person was a CTO and talking about a CEO. And the reason why is that everything up until that moment, I was assuming this person really had no power in the organization. Maybe they were sort of a middle or frontline manager, sort of distance from the CEO. And I think there's a different sort of responsibility or accountability if you do have that much authority in an organization. Because one of the things that he asked at the very end is like, is there a place that I can look for a better job? And the way that I look at it is, at that level, you have both the opportunity and the obligation to interview your team as much as they are interviewing you when you're looking for a job. So it's not so much as like, I don't think you need a job board, because in most other cases, like if you're an engineer, level 1 engineer applying for a job at a company, you're not going to, the same expectation and opportunity to really like get to know the team in the company aren't going to be afforded to you the way that it would be afforded to a CTO candidate who is joining the company. So I think he has more power to find a good match than maybe, or she has more power.
I was just going to jump in on that. So thank you.
Yes, because we've removed the identifying information. So
yes.
Bias, purple flag, waving on myself. They have more power to identify a good match of an organization who shares a similar management philosophy with them. So that was like thing number one, which is don't despair, but make this an important part of the way that you choose any job. Interview your boss the same way that they are interviewing you. And as a team member at the level of, a chief anything, that should be acceptable. And if it's not acceptable, if they don't allow you to do that, that's a huge red flag, right? If they're like, well, you don't need to know my management philosophy, why are you asking me these questions? Well, you've just answered whether or not that's going to be a great company to work for.
I want to offer a little compassion for this CTO, having taken several quite senior jobs with bosses who I kind of knew in the beginning they were not quite right, but somehow the opportunity was so great, and I imagined I would have so much authority in the organization that I could build my own kind of culture and fix everything. And in both of those cases, I wound up miserable for years. So I feel this person's pain, even though I thought I knew better. And I thought I was, I would have said, you got to make sure that you're interviewing your boss and getting into a disagreement with your boss before you take the job. I have all this great advice. But somehow twice I failed to heed my own advice.
Kim, I am so curious about that. Like, as you look back, because I also feel like it's probably relationship advice. We might see the red flags, but we're like, I'm different. This is going to be different. Like, what was the script in your head that was overpowering the sort of inner red flag?
That may be too deep a question for a quick podcast, but I think that part of it was that I really believed I'm going to have such a senior role at this company that I'm going to be able to create my own environment, and it won't matter. I'll be this super strong shit umbrella for my team, and all this. I can shield my team from this person's bad behavior, and I don't know, maybe a superhero complex. I don't know what happened in either one of those cases, really, is the TLDR. But I think that it's easy to make that mistake.
Well, that's why I'm asking, because I think, to your point, like, we can have compassion for someone who's like, well, sort of being optimistic. I can have my own universe. Is there another question that person that you could ask in that interview if it's not the CEO, or is there other data that could help you see if that's even possible to create your own universe, even if the CEO is more top-down command and control?
Yeah, I think the advice that I got about hiring also extends to taking a job, which is if you're not dying to work for that person, do not take the job if you can possibly help it. I think it's easy to say that. It's sometimes really hard to do it because maybe you really need the job. In one case, I really needed the job, and it was a job that was, that promised to be incredibly lucrative. And I think maybe part of it was greed or money or something, caused me to override what I sort of knew in my gut to be true. But that happened. It happens to people. So I wouldn't necessarily say that, that you can choose 4 bad bosses in a row, and it doesn't mean you're a terrible chooser of bosses, but it does mean polish up your old resume, figure out what you learned from each of those 4 experiences, and make a new mistake next time. Don't make the same mistake.
And by the way, I feel a lot of compassion for this person. And also, I love that they're still having these one-on-ones with the contractors, even though they're, quote, not supposed to, and just sort of the spirit of that. Jason, what do you think of what Kim said and our CTO, who is maybe optimizing for other things beyond the relationship with the boss?
Well, I just want to acknowledge that I think that there's something implicit that's happened in the past 5 minutes, which is that you have both felt the need to show compassion for this person because I think you felt like I challenged them very directly, and it always makes me nervous when I read a note from someone who is externalizing their problems, because that is disempowering. When you say the world is happening to me, these bosses don't get it, like I don't know what to do, it's completely a complete waste. Because one of the reflections that I had, Brandy and I talked about this note when we first got it, and one of the reflections that I had was, it's sad to me to see that they're saying, I'm just going to, like, none of this has mattered. My guess is those one-on-ones that they were holding did matter. They made a big difference to the people they were holding them with. And I think when you externalize the problem, it makes it harder to see that when the things you're doing actually are having an influence, because you start to assume that it's out of my control. And so my encouragement to this person would be to look back at that experience and actually try to do a more sort of scientific evaluation of saying what things made a difference and that I did, and to whom. And do I think it's worth continuing to do those things? Because to Kim's point and to your point, maybe I can learn something from that. And maybe that's a way that that's a question that I bring into a future job interview, which is, I think it's important to have developmental discussions, not just with employees, but with contractors. Maybe that's a good area for potential disagreement with a future employer. Part of the reason why I was feeling maybe more like a challenge directly response was appropriate is because of not because of this person, but because of the fear that I feel, the behavior, the pattern behavior that I've observed, which is that once you externalize these things and you stop seeing your own ability to control, it can be a very steep and downward spiral to misery. So finding those things that you can control and evaluating yourself fairly and your behavior fairly and the impact that you had fairly is an important step to take so that you don't, so that you see the power that you have to change the future, to change the next job, or to change the way that you interact with the future team that you have, even if your boss is not perfectly aligned with your management philosophy.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I also think that because I've been in a situation where I was managing contractors, and there are all kinds of kooky laws around managing contractors. And I was told by the legal team that I couldn't do certain things for the contractors. Otherwise, they would no longer legally be contractors. So there's a whole body of the law is an ass sort of problem here, and that may be part of what was presenting in this situation. I certainly have experienced that before. I also will say that it is often true that you are doing things for your team that are not being done for you. And that will only take you so far, actually. Like at some point, not only does your team need these things, you need to be treated in a particular way. And I think that's part of what this person was asking is, I can do this for my team and it matters, but how can I find, I've had these 4 bad experiences and now I'm pessimistic that I will ever find a CEO who shares my management philosophy. And I agree with you, Jason. Like it's too soon to despair, but it's also kind of understandable that one might feel some despair in that situation. And
absolutely.
And it's a little bit like if you've had a series of bad romances. You get, in fact,
if you may quote Lady Gaga, yes, please.
yes. If I may quote Lady Gaga, I mean, for example, I mean, I don't mean to compare management to dating, but I'm going to do it anyway. At one point, I didn't get married till late in life. I didn't find a life partner, and I had a series of disastrous romances, and I was on Match.com. And I wrote a profile and I showed it to a friend of mine and she read it and she said, Kim, you know what this says? This says, I haven't met you yet and I already hate you. And so what I'm trying to say is when you're polishing up
don't put I haven't met you, CEO, but I already hate you in your LinkedIn profile is words to live by.
It's easy to start to feel that way when you've had a bunch of terrible experiences with terrible bosses. And so what I would encourage this listener is to try to do what you can to wipe the slate clean and look for a new boss. It is possible to find a good boss. I just want to extend that note of hope.
I love the note of hope and just bringing in the agency from Jason. And just, one of the things, we did a bunch of public courses in the last few years, some around our Feedback Loop comedy series. And one of the things that people loved from that was that they were often feeling like they were the only person in their organization that was committed to practicing radical candor. And, we often say it takes 2 to practice radical candor. And while you might be able to do it with your team, as you said, Kim, you really need to find people that are kind of sending it back your way, especially the care and especially reminding you of the agency. So I think just also acknowledging the job board or networking group, just kind of that human need to feel like you're not alone and that it takes practice and having kind of a community of practice. So acknowledging that. Jason, anything more before we move on, or tips on LinkedIn profile, beginner's mind when you've had a series of bad bosses / romances?
Yes.
Not romance. To be clear, not romances with the boss. That's a different podcast.
I've done that. I made that mistake too. Sorry. Terrible idea.
That's another episode.
I think I would only echo Kim's encouragement that there are good bosses out there and not to despair. I think this person has learned a lot, and they can use what they've learned to make the future better. So don't give up.
Great way to close on that one. Our last one is from a boss. This boss has been getting feedback that yikes, might be a bad boss. This person writes, first of all, your work made me a better person and my 40-person startup company a better company. So yay. Second, I feel like I am shit at communication. People give me feedback about feeling stressed and pushed when meeting with me about work. They also feel I'm rushed and unavailable. Obviously, I love this person's sensibility. Obviously, this is the gist of their stories between the flowers and the sandwich spread. Generally, I feel my leadership communication is quite shit, LOL. Do you have tips on resources or practices I can perform to become a better communicator as a leader? Before I turn it over to you all, I have to say, I feel like this person's communicating great and has a lot of self-awareness and some of that kind of humor, self-deprecating humor as a boss, which is foundational. So I just really appreciate the spirit in which the question was asked. Jason, what's coming up for you on either the specific question, tips on resources or practices, and then just in general, this feeling like as a boss, like my communication sucks. Now what?
Yeah, I guess my question is, are you stressed and are you rushed? If you're stressed and you're rushed, and another question is, is there a time when you're not stressed or not rushed, and how is your communication still shit? I recently sent an email in a rush, and I did not imbue it with my usual level of care personally, and I feel like I failed in that instance to communicate. But I have the good fortune of usually not feeling rushed, and so usually my communication has more care personally. And Kim was like, "Hey, you didn't insert your usual degree of care personally in that email," and so that's why I'm like, when someone says I'm terrible at something, further criticism is often not a very useful thing, because what you really want to do is find the moments where they're good at the thing and say, what is it about that moment, you in that moment, or the context of that moment, that allows you to be a better communicator? And that usually is like provides some breadcrumbs to follow to how you can improve. Because I doubt, based on the quality of this email, that this person simply can't communicate.
Yeah, totally agree. I was going to say, my first instinct is growth mindset. Go read Carol Dweck's book. You're not a shit communicator. You're a good communicator. The second thing that I thought listening to this is, leading a 40-person startup is, pardon my French, fucking exhausting. And so cut yourself some slack. You probably are rushed and you probably are unavailable. I was coaching the CEO of a fast-growing startup, and someone came up to him and said, I never want to come talk to you because you always seem like you have the weight of the world on your shoulders. And at first he was a pretty good actor. So he was trying to walk around the office looking all loose, but I'm like, you're not feeling all loose, and you can only you can't really act your way out of this. I mean, he was a good actor. But then people would come up to him and dump stuff on him, and then he was feeling worse, And so I think one of the things that we did he did it, was one, to block some think time in calendar. Because I think very often, at least for me, what happens is work is piling up all day long. There are new problems, new things to think about, new problems to resolve, documents to be read, and all day long I'm piling that stuff up to do when I get home. And the fact of the matter is, when I get home, I need to decompress, And so every new thing that gets added to my sort of dreaded list, I'm ready to snap at somebody. And so one of the things I've tried to do is to make sure that I'm blocking time to work during work in my calendar. And that probably means having a few fewer meetings. So blocking some think time was helpful. And then the other thing that he did that worked for him and that has worked for me is to block some wander time, wander around and chit chat with people time. Actually put that in your calendar. And that can help people feel like you are approachable, because you want to be, as a leader, approachable. You want people to be able to come to you with what they're worried about and to be able to point them in the right direction, but not take everybody else's problems on your own shoulders, because you'll get crushed.
I really appreciate the think time, the wander time. Both of you mentioned how, first of all, this person has a good bit of self-awareness, give themselves a bit of a break, and also that the folks around them might be picking up on them feeling rushed, unavailable. And what I will say is, having taught, tens of thousands of CEOs and really busy leaders mindfulness over the years, I got some feedback from someone who said, this direct report said, by starting to practice just a little bit of mindfulness, they felt that person was more present with them in the meetings. And so even just, 30 seconds, a minute before that person comes in to take a few breaths and just to start to feel a little more centered, when you are fully present with the other person, a few minutes of full presence can be far more meaningful than 30 minutes of distraction. And people pick up on that. So I just want to say there's little tips that you can do to help yourself kind of fill your own cup to be more present that will reverberate in how people respond to you. Jason, what was on your mind?
Oh, I was reminded of the Radical Candor also. Like, I think which is this idea of, can you encourage people in the moment? In your case, it's not to let you know when it's going wrong, but to let you know when it's going right. I was trying to think of, like, how can you gather data on when I'm doing better? Because if people are willing to give him the feedback that he's not doing well, they probably would be okay. Like, they're probably not nervous about telling him when he's getting it right. So, like, that might be the other ask that you can make.
Was this another him?
A good question.
We don't know. Could be a she. Okay.
Well, okay. Anyhow, sorry.
Regardless of the person's gender.
Or they. If they would ask for that support, they might actually get it. So it might be the case that people are feeling extremely frustrated, and so you're hearing mostly the negative, but you could ask for the positive in this particular case because you've at least already acknowledged it.
I love that idea, and to really, like, in the moment, what's working well, because you want to actually be able to replicate it. So fantastic. Shall we wrap? Anything more on tips to become a better communicator? We have got get some what we would call praise, sort of in the moment. What am I doing well so that I can do more of it? From Kim, getting some think time, some wander time, maybe a couple of mindful breaths, and maybe give yourself a little bit of a break too, that we really appreciate. You're in a tough spot as well. Anything to wrap up now before we head into our tips?
Do it.
I think we're good.
All right, so it's time now for our Radical Candor checklist. These are tips you can use to start putting Radical Candor into practice.
Tip number 1, Jason, take it away.
Okay, tip number 1. If you get feedback along the lines of, I don't want to work for a kid, take a moment to try to be curious about where that might be coming from. It can be useful just to ask directly, why don't you want to work for a kid? What is it about working for a kid that worries you? Try to get that person to be more specific, because you might be in the presence of some really good advice about things you could do differently to make the team work better.
Tip number 2, if you are deciding whether or not to accept a job offer, trust your gut on what you feel about the person who is going to be your boss. It is really important. If you're not dying to work for this person, do not take the job if you can possibly help it. And find someone else who's worked for that person and ask them what it was like to work for the person. Another tip, if you're going to take a job, is try getting into an argument with that person before you take the job and see what it's like to disagree with the person.
Tip number 4, fill your own cup first. If you're feeling rushed and stressed when you're communicating with other people, go ahead and block some think time on your calendar so you can focus on what you need to get done, or just to clear your head, a few moments of just taking care of yourself. You can put wander time on your calendar to walk around so you can engage with folks in a more relaxed manner. And if you're remote, one tip that we have for you is to schedule virtual office hours once a month, just like Jason, you do now for the Radical Candor team and coaches. Well, for more tips, you can go to radicalcandor.com/resources to download our learning guides for practicing Radical Candor. The show notes for this episode, you can find them at radicalcandor.com/podcast. If you like what you hear, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Career topics you want us to discuss, you can email us podcast@radicalcandor.com. As you know, if you're listening this long, we suspect you've heard it once or twice. Go to radicalcandor.com for your Radical Candor swag. Click the shop link, coffee mugs, magnets, notepads, and more. Bye for now.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks for joining us. Our podcast features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff, is produced by our Director of Content, Brandy Neal, and hosted by me, Amy Sandler. Music is by Cliff Goldmacher. Go ahead and follow us on Twitter @Candor and find us online at radicalcandor.com.